They scheduled it for 8:30 on a Tuesday morning. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the firing itself, not the cameras, not even what came after. Just the casual cruelty of putting it on my Outlook calendar like it was a goddamn dentist appointment. Q3 Strategic Alignment Review. That was the subject line. I remember reading it on Monday night while I was eating leftover meatloaf at my kitchen counter. And I actually thought to myself, well, at least it's early. I can be back at my desk by 10. My name's Raymond Crowley. People call me Ray. I'm 57 years old, and I spent the last 31 years of my life building the operations infrastructure at Brennan Hawthorne Manufacturing in Toledo, Ohio. We make industrial valves. Boring stuff. The kind of thing nobody thinks about until something blows up at a refinery, and suddenly everybody's an expert. I started there as a third-shift maintenance tech in 1994, 2 months after my daughter Hannah was born, back when Bill Clinton was still in his first term, and I had a full head of dark hair and a pickup truck I'd just paid off. I worked my way up, took night classes at the University of Toledo for 7 years to get my engineering degree, while my wife Margaret picked up extra shifts at Mercy Hospital. I designed our quality assurance protocols in 2003 after we lost a major Department of Defense contract. I rewrote the entire vendor compliance system in 2011 when the industry got serious about supply chain audits. By 2018, I was the Director of Operations and Compliance, reporting directly to the COO, and there wasn't a single critical contract that moved through Brennan Hawthorne that didn't have my fingerprints on it somewhere. That Tuesday morning, I parked my Silverado in spot 47, the one I'd been parking in since 2009. I grabbed my travel mug, walked across the lot in the cold November air, and badged into the east entrance. Same as 700-800 mornings before that one. The first thing I noticed was that the conference room blinds were down. Now, that's not necessarily strange, but Brennan Hawthorne is an open culture kind of place. Glass walls everywhere. The blinds being down for an 8:30 meeting on a random Tuesday meant something was happening that they didn't want the floor to see. The second thing I noticed was the camera tripod set up in the corner, not the cheap webcam mounted on top of the TV for our Microsoft Teams calls. An actual standalone camera on a tripod, the kind you'd use for a press conference. I sat down in my usual seat, third one from the door on the right side. Vanessa Holbrook was already at the head of the table. She'd been our CEO for 14 months at that point, brought in by the board after the Hawthorne family finally sold the controlling stake to a private equity group out of Cleveland. She was 44, sharp, expensive haircut, the kind of woman who used the word synergy without irony. I'd never warmed up to her, but I'd never given her any reason to dislike me either. I just did my job and kept my mouth shut, the way you learn to do when you've been somewhere long enough to watch 4 CEOs come and go. Around me, maybe 16, 17 people filed in. Mostly senior management. A couple of the younger directors from the digital transformation initiative she'd hired straight out of consulting firms in Chicago. Nobody was making eye contact with me, which I clocked immediately, but tried to ignore. You ever walk into a room and feel like you've already been talked about? That's what it felt like. She started with the corporate boilerplate. Brennan Hawthorne's evolution, the pace of change, the need to align our leadership with our forward trajectory. I sat there with my hands folded on the table, my coffee getting cold, and I started doing the math in my head, which is something I do when I'm trying not to feel things. House note, $1,840 a month? 11 years left. Hannah was 31 now and married, but our son Patrick was a senior at Ohio State, full ride for the academics, but we were still covering his living expenses, about $1,400 a month. My 401k had taken a beating in the 2022 downturn and was just now climbing back. Margaret had retired from nursing 2 years ago after her knee replacement. We were okay. Not rich, but okay. The kind of okay that depends on me getting up every Tuesday morning at 5:45 and driving to spot 47. Then I heard my name. Raymond Crowley's role no longer aligns with the strategic direction of Brennan Hawthorne Manufacturing. That was the sentence. I want you to understand, there was no warning, no performance review where someone hinted at problems, no PIP, No HR meeting, just that sentence, delivered by Vanessa Holbrook into a tripod-mounted camera in front of 16 people who had been my colleagues for years. I felt the heat rise in my face, but I kept my expression flat. 31 years of swallowing things in industrial environments teaches you that. You don't react. You don't give them anything. There's a man at the end of the table named Curtis, runs our Mexico operations, and I caught him staring at his coffee like it was the most fascinating thing he'd ever seen. She kept talking, something about pivoting to a more digitally native operations model, something about appreciation for my decades of service. The words just slid past me. The only thing I could really focus on was the small red light on the camera, and the realization that this was being recorded for a reason. They were going to send this to the board. They were going to send it to the private equity guys in Cleveland. This wasn't a firing, this was a piece of corporate theater designed to make her look decisive. When she finished, there was that horrible, polite clapping. Maybe 4 people. The rest just sat there. I stood up slowly, picked up my travel mug, and walked out of the room. I didn't say a word. What was there to say? Here's the part Vanessa Holbrook didn't understand, and the part nobody in that room understood, except maybe 2 or 3 of the older engineers. Brennan Hawthorne Manufacturing was 3 weeks away from closing the largest deal in the company's 78-year history. A $610 million acquisition by Sterling Industrial Group, a publicly traded conglomerate based in Charlotte. The deal had been in negotiation for 9 months. It was the entire reason Vanessa had been hired in the first place. Get the company cleaned up, get the metrics where they needed to be, get the deal closed, collect her bonus, and move on to the next gig. What she didn't know, what nobody had bothered to ask me about in the 11 months since she'd taken over, with that every single quality compliance certification Brennan Hawthorne held with the Department of Defense and with our top 6 commercial customers, ran through a verification system that I had personally architected and signed off on year after year since 2007. It wasn't fancy. There was nothing magical about it. It was just thorough. A 4-stage authentication chain that I'd built after the 2003 contract loss nearly bankrupted us. Stage 1, identity verification of the certifying officer. Stage 2, document chain of custody validation. Stage 3, regulatory compliance attestation under federal NIST standards. Stage 4, my personal cryptographic signature as the named compliance authority of record, registered with the Defense Logistics Agency. Every contract over $5 million, every certification renewal, every M&A due diligence package, every audit response. They all required all 4 stages, and Stage 4 required me, not my title, me, Raymond Crowley, by name, as the registered authority on file with the federal government. And here's the kicker. Replacing the registered compliance authority of record requires a 90-day federal notification period under DLA regulations. You can't just swap somebody in. The Department of Defense needs to vet the replacement, run background checks, review their qualifications, and update their records. Sterling Industrial wasn't going to wait 90 days. They had quarterly earnings reports, they had analyst expectations, they had financing committed. Vanessa Holbrook had just fired me with 3 weeks left on the merger clock, and no idea she'd cut the only thread holding her billion-dollar deal together. I didn't go home right away after I left the building. I drove to a Bob Evans on Reynolds Road and sat in the parking lot for a while. Just sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, watching an old couple slowly make their way from their Buick to the front door of the restaurant. The man was holding the woman's elbow. She was using a walker. They were laughing about something. I thought about Margaret. I thought about how I was going to tell her. I thought about Patrick, 2 months from graduation, asking me at Thanksgiving if I'd help him with the security deposit on an apartment in Columbus when he started his job at Nationwide. I went inside and ordered the breakfast platter. Eggs over easy, sausage links, hash browns, dry wheat toast, same thing I'd ordered there since 1997. The waitress, her name was Diane, she'd been working there for as long as I'd been going there, and she said, "You're here early, Hone. Day off?" I smiled at her and said, "Something like that." I drove home around 11. Margaret was in the garden, putting it to bed for the winter. She had her gloves on and her hair in that messy bun she does when she's working outside. She looked up when she heard the truck, and I saw her face change because she could tell, instantly, the way wives can. She stood up and walked toward me, and she didn't say anything. She just put her arms around me and held on. I told her in the kitchen, sitting at the table with the morning light coming through the window over the sink. She listened. She didn't cry. She didn't get angry. She just listened. And when I was done, she said, "Ray, you've worked there for 31 years. They cannot just do that." "They can," I said. "They did." She got up and made fresh coffee. While the pot was brewing, she said, "What about the merger?" That's when I smiled. Because, Margaret, you have to understand. Margaret has heard me talk about the compliance system for 2 decades. She doesn't understand all the technical details, but she understands the broader picture. She understands that I built that system specifically because I didn't trust people like Vanessa Holbrook to do the right thing. "Sweetheart," I said, "they have no idea what they just did." The first call came in on Thursday morning, 48 hours after the firing. It was Kelvin Stoddard, our general counsel. Kelvin and I have known each other for 20-some years. We coached our kids' Little League teams together back in the early 2000s. His son Tyler and my son Patrick were on the same team that won the city championship in 2008. Kelvin's a good man, decent lawyer, but he was also on the conference call when Vanessa fired me, and he didn't say a word in my defense. "Ray," he said, his voice sounded tight, "I don't know how to ask you this." "Then don't ask me, Kelvin," I said. "Just say what you need to say." He paused. I could hear him breathing. Then he said, "We're running into some issues with the Sterling due diligence package. The DLA verification chain is showing your credentials as the active authority of record, and we can't seem to advance the process without your authentication." "Kelvin," I said, "I haven't been an employee of Brennan Hawthorne for 2 days. I have no obligation to authenticate anything for that company. I don't even have system access." "I know," he said. "Vanessa asking if you'd be willing to come in for a brief consulting engagement, just to bridge the gap while we transition the registration." I almost laughed. I poured myself another cup of coffee and looked out at the bird feeder Margaret had hung from the maple tree outside the kitchen window. "Kelvin, my friend," I said, "you tell Vanessa Holbrook that I am 60 days away from filing for unemployment, that my health insurance lapses on December 31st, and that I am deeply, deeply uninterested in helping her close a deal that's going to make her several $1,000,000 in performance bonuses." There was a long silence on the line. "I understand," he said finally. "I'll relay that." "You do that," I said, and I hung up. By Friday afternoon, the calls were coming in every hour. The COO, the chief financial officer, a senior VP I'd worked with for 15 years who left me a voicemail that started with, "Ray, buddy, look, I know how it must feel." I didn't return any of them. On Saturday morning, I was at the Home Depot picking up some weather stripping when my cell rang from a number I didn't recognize. Charlotte, area code. I let it go to voicemail and listened to it in the parking lot. It was a man named Trevor Ashby. Said he was a senior vice president at Sterling Industrial Group. Said he'd appreciate the opportunity to speak with me at my convenience. Left a direct line. Calm voice. No desperation. Just a professional reaching out to another professional. I sat in the truck for a few minutes thinking about it. Then I dialed him back. "Mr. Crowley," he said when he answered, "thank you for returning my call. I'll come right to the point. I'm aware of the situation that has developed at Brennan Hawthorne. I'm aware that you were terminated last Tuesday, and I am aware that the federal compliance architecture for that company is registered to you personally, not to the corporation." "Go on," I said. "I'm not calling to ask you to authenticate anything," he said. "I want to be very clear about that. Sterling Industrial is currently reevaluating our entire approach to the Brennan Hawthorne acquisition. What I'm calling about is something else entirely." He paused. "Mr. Crowley," he said, "Sterling Industrial has been looking for someone to lead our enterprise compliance program for our defense and aerospace divisions. We've been looking for almost a year. The candidates we've interviewed have been adequate. None of them have built what you've built. Would you be willing to fly down to Charlotte on our dime for a conversation?" I held the phone away from my ear for a second and looked out at a kid in the parking lot pushing a cart full of mulch back to his mother's minivan. "Mr. Minivan, Ashby," I said, "what kind of role are we talking about? Vice President, Enterprise Compliance, reporting to the Chief Risk Officer. Base salary in the high 250s, performance bonus structure, equity package, full relocation if you want it, or remote work from Toledo if you prefer. We're flexible. We just want the right person. I want you to imagine sitting in a Home Depot parking lot in your Silverado 4 days after you've been fired, in front of a tripod-mounted camera, listening to a stranger from North Carolina offer you more money than you've ever made in your life to do exactly the work you've been doing for 30 years. I told him I'd call him back on Monday. I drove home, and I didn't tell Margaret right away. I wanted to think about it. I wanted to make sure I wasn't making a decision out of spite or hurt pride. I went out to the garage and started organizing my workbench, which is what I do when I need to think. Margaret came out after an hour with a sandwich and a cup of coffee, and she said, "Are you going to tell me what's going on, or are you going to organize that bench until we both die?" I told her. She sat down on the old patio chair we keep in the corner of the garage, the one with the green cushion that's faded almost to white, and she said, "Ray, what do you want to do?" "I want to tell them yes," I said, "but I'm worried it looks like revenge." "Honey," she said, "they fired you on a Tuesday morning in front of a camera. After 31 years. That ship has sailed." I called Trevor Ashby on Monday morning at 9. I flew to Charlotte on Wednesday. I met with him, with the Chief Risk Officer, with their CEO, and with 2 senior board members. They put me up at the Ritz-Carlton. Margaret came with me, and we ordered room service for the first time in our marriage. Lobster bisque and a steak. She laughed about it later because she said it tasted like a regular steak, just more expensive. On Thursday, Sterling Industrial sent me a formal offer letter. Vice President, Enterprise Compliance. Base salary $268,000. Annual performance bonus targeted at 35% of base. Equity grant valued at $180,000 vesting over 4 years. Full benefits, signing bonus of $50,000, and the option to work primarily from home with monthly travel to Charlotte. I signed it on Friday morning at our kitchen table while Margaret made pancakes. The Brennan Hawthorne situation in the meantime was unraveling in real time, and I had a front row seat through the local business press and the few former colleagues who were still texting me with updates. Sterling Industrial publicly suspended the acquisition on the second Wednesday after my firing. Their press release was carefully worded. Phrases like outstanding due diligence concerns and operational continuity questions. The Toledo Blade picked up the story. So did Crane's Cleveland. Brennan Hawthorne's privately held value was estimated to drop by somewhere between 20 and 30%. Vanessa Holbrook gave an interview to the local business journal about how the company was pivoting toward a more diversified strategic future and how short-term setbacks were the price of long-term transformation. I read it on my back porch with a glass of bourbon, and I did not feel sorry for her. Then, in early December, things got considerably more interesting. I got a call from a woman named Andrea Lynn, who introduced herself as a special agent with the Defense Criminal Investigative Service. She wanted to come talk to me. She said it was related to the compliance architecture I'd built at Brennan Hawthorne, and she said it was important. She came to my house on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks before Christmas, sat at my kitchen table, drank a cup of coffee, asked me very specific questions about the audit logs my system maintained, about the timestamps on certain compliance attestations from 2022 and 2023, about a series of transactions involving a subcontractor in Pennsylvania that had been routing parts through a shell company in Delaware. I answered her questions honestly. I'd built the system to keep records that couldn't be altered, not because I was looking for fraud, just because that's how you build a system that you can stake your professional license on. Every signature, every timestamp, every modification was logged and cryptographically sealed. It turned out Vanessa Holbrook and her CFO had been quietly fudging the contract numbers on 3 Department of Defense subcontracts, marking up materials by inflating the verification fees being paid to the Pennsylvania Shell Company, which was, of course, owned by a holding company that traced back to her brother-in-law. She'd been doing it for about 18 months. It was small enough that nobody had noticed. About $4.2 million in total over that period. A rounding error compared to the mergers she was trying to close. But it was federal contract fraud, plain and simple, and every single one of those transactions was logged in my system. Time-stamped. Cryptographically sealed. Untouchable. When she'd fired me, she hadn't realized that she was firing the only person who could shield her from her own paper trail. I want to tell you about the day I drove past Brennan Hawthorne for the last time. It was a Thursday in January. There was snow on the ground, but the roads were clear. I'd taken Margaret out to lunch, and on the way back she said, "You want to drive past the old place?" I didn't really, but I said yes. We drove down Holland-Sylvania Road, and I slowed down as we passed the front entrance. The Brennan Hawthorne sign was still there. The flagpole, Spot 47, where my truck used to be parked, was empty. There were 3 black SUVs in the visitor lot near the executive entrance. Federal vehicles. They'd been there for about a week, I'd heard. Vanessa Holbrook was placed on administrative leave on January 9th. She was indicted on March 14th on 6 counts including federal contract fraud, wire fraud, and conspiracy. The CFO took a plea deal and testified against her. She was convicted that summer and sentenced to 51 months in federal prison. The Sterling Industrial deal, of course, never happened. Brennan Hawthorne ended up being sold to a private equity buyer for about $340 million, less than 60% of the original Sterling offer. The board chairman, who had personally signed off on Vanessa's hiring, resigned in disgrace. About a third of the senior leadership team I'd worked with was let go in the restructuring. Curtis, who'd stared at his coffee while I was being fired, lost his job in the second wave of cuts and apparently struggled to find anything comparable. I didn't celebrate. I didn't gloat, but I didn't lose any sleep over it either. Kelvin Stoddard called me in late February to apologize. Said he should have spoken up. Said he'd been thinking about it every day. I told him I appreciated the call and I meant it, but I also told him that I wasn't ready to have lunch with him just yet, and he understood. We're better now. Not what we were, but better. I started at Sterling Industrial on January 15th. I work mostly from home, in a small office I built out in what used to be Patrick's bedroom. I fly to Charlotte once a month. I have a team of 14 people, half of them younger than my own kids, all of them sharper than I deserve. They listen when I talk. They ask follow-up questions. When I tell them why we do something a certain way, they don't roll their eyes. Patrick graduated from Ohio State in May. He moved to Columbus for the nationwide job. He came over for dinner on a Sunday in June, and at one point during the evening he said, "Dad, you're different now. You laugh more." I told him I felt different. Hannah and her husband had their first baby last September, a little boy they named Henry after Margaret's father. I drove down to Cincinnati to meet him on his second day of life. I held him in my arms in that hospital room, and I thought about the morning I sat in the Bob Evans parking lot, exactly 7 months before, wondering if my life was over. The mortgage will be paid off in 3 years instead of 11. We took our first real vacation in 15 years over the 4th of July, drove out to Glacier National Park, just Margaret and me and the dog. I cried at one of the overlooks, and I'm not embarrassed to admit it. Margaret asked me one night, while we were sitting on the porch of a cabin somewhere in Montana, whether I missed it. The old job. The old life. "No," I said. "Not at all," I said. "Not for 1 second." She nodded, and we just sat there for a while listening to the wind in the pines. Here's what I want anybody listening to this to understand. If you've been there long, if you've done the work, if you've kept your head down and done the right thing for years, decades even, and somebody decides one Tuesday morning that you're no longer aligned with their strategic vision, I want you to know something. The thing they think they're throwing away might be the only thing holding their world together. And when it comes apart, and it will come apart, you don't have to be the one to push it. You don't have to hate them. You don't have to plot revenge. You just have to keep your dignity, walk out the door, and let the work you did speak for itself. The truth has a way of finding daylight. The systems you built, honestly, will protect you when the people you trusted won't. I'm 58 years old now. My back hurts in the mornings. My hair's gone almost completely gray. I make more money than I ever thought I'd make, and I work for people who actually understand what I do. And every once in a while, when I'm sitting at my kitchen table, early in the morning, with a fresh cup of coffee, watching the sunrise come up over the maple tree where Margaret hangs the bird feeder, I think about that Tuesday morning. The cold air in the parking lot, the blinds being down, the little red light on the camera, and I smile. Not because I won, but because I finally understand that I never had to. I think about that Tuesday morning more than I probably should, not in a bitter way, more like the way you turn a stone over in your hand to look at the underside, because everything that happened after, all of it, every single piece, was already set in motion long before Vanessa Holbrook ever walked into that conference room with her tripod camera and her rehearsed sentence. The system that ended her career? I built it in 2007. The federal registration that made me legally untouchable? I filed that paperwork in 2009 on a Saturday afternoon while Margaret was at her sister's birthday party. The honest record-keeping that fed the evidence to Special Agent Lynn? That was just me doing my job week after week for 16 years when nobody was watching and nobody cared. That's the thing about cause and effect that I don't think young people understand anymore. The harvest you reap on a Tuesday morning was planted decades earlier, not all at once, in small, daily, unremarkable choices. The choice to do the paperwork right when nobody would have noticed if you'd cut a corner. The choice to keep your word to a contractor in Pennsylvania, even when it would have been easier to bend. The choice to say no, quietly, in a meeting room in 2019 when your CFO suggested an accounting practice that didn't smell right. I'm not a particularly impressive man. I want to be clear about that. I'm not smarter than the people who fired me. I went to a state school at night while my kids were small. I drive a pickup truck, and I shop at the same Home Depot I shopped at 20 years ago. What I did have, and what I think most people underestimate, is the discipline to be the same person on Tuesday morning that I am on Saturday night. To do the work the right way even when nobody would catch me doing it the wrong way. That's what people mean when they talk about character. It isn't grand. It isn't a speech. It's just what you do when you think nobody's looking. Repeated for 3 decades. Vanessa Holbrook had a Harvard MBA and an instinct for the camera and zero understanding of the slow accumulation of trust. She thought the system was hers because her business card said CEO. She didn't realize the system belonged to whoever had built it honestly, day after day for years. And when the moment came, the system protected the person who had earned it and exposed the person who hadn't. If you take anything from what I've told you, take this. You don't need to plan revenge. You don't need to learn to be ruthless. You don't need to become the person who hurt you. You just need to keep doing the work. Tell the truth on the small things. Sign your name to honest paperwork. Treat the people below you with the same dignity you offer the people above you. Be the same man on a parking lot Tuesday morning that you were at Thanksgiving dinner. Margaret reminded me of something the night I signed the Sterling offer. She said, integrity isn't a strategy. It's a foundation. Everything else gets built on top of it, or it doesn't get built at all. 31 years. That's what I gave Brennan Hawthorne. And the version of me they fired on a Tuesday morning was the same version they hired in 1994. That never changed. They did.